Dr. Louise Crabtree. Louise is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. Louise focuses on social, ecological and economic sustainability of community-driven housing development and on innovation in housing practice and policy like community land trusts, among many other things. Louise is here tonight to talk to us on livable communities. Please welcome Louise Crabtree.
Thanks, Mark. I need to know where there's my down button. Okay, awesome. In thinking about the Australia that we want, we have to think about our communities and the places that we live in. And to an extent, for me, it's hard to think about policies and not think about our communities. Whether we're in the city, the suburbs, a regional area or a remote Australia, we're always living amongst others. Our communities are the context and the fabric of our daily lives. They're the arena in which possibly hackneyed ideas about us being egalitarian or championing for a fair go are actually lived out, or where we at least try to live them out. Yet current political discourse seems to dislocate us as people in communities from discussions of cities or regions. So we hear of infrastructure and mega projects of jobs and growth, but almost as though there are no people using that infrastructure or working in those jobs. Certainly we never hear public discussion of whether growth in and of itself serves the common good. And the smart cities that we increasingly hear of seem oddly devoid of people. And the infrastructure and projects seem devoid of purpose. So I think we can do better than this, and I don't think it should take much to do so. I liked the celebration of our current medical system, and I think there's a lot we can currently celebrate about how we do cities and communities, but we need to be doing better. So I actually started out studying to be a vet. I wound my way through conservation biology, climatology and ecology to wind up with a PhD in human geography, which is really nice. I can say I'm a human geographer compared to those inhuman geographers. But I've wound up doing a lot of work on housing because what all of that training in biological and social sciences told me is that most of our problems stem from how we as humans live in place and the relationships that we establish between ourselves as individuals, with and in place, and with non-human cohabitants. So the nature of these relationships impact on us, both as individuals and as societies, and on the non-human. And these relationships are fundamentally shaped by the principles that we then use these to uphold. So what are those principles and how do we manifest them? So I want to talk about what happens when a housing system is constructed to favour economic interests over other interests, as is the case in Australia. In my work, I've seen it render tenants in badly constructed public housing unable to make modifications to their homes to deal with increasingly extreme heat, such that on a 45-degree day, all they can do is shut the house down, find the least hot place in the house and lie still on the floor for hours. I've examined a thesis of documenting renters in Tasmania having to choose between food and heating in winter, again, largely because they can't make improvements to their home and the landlord doesn't have the capacity, incentive or requirement to do so. I've seen tourist towns unable to house their own children or the staff who keep the tourism businesses afloat because of city folk 100 kilometres away leveraging multiple other properties to pay $1 million a pop to buy a local home and put it on Airbnb. I've seen those towns near empty for 9 months of the off-season while the ageing locals watch their children move away to find affordable places where they can start to worry about their own children's future. Families trying to leave violence, returning to it because they have no choice except maybe living in their car. People ageing in place alone, scared and unable to manage their home because it's become inhospitable as their physical and cognitive abilities change. And don't get me started on what I've seen some of our First Peoples endure because of badly conceived and unsympathetic housing policies. I could go on, but it gets depressing and infuriating. This is nuts. We can and must do better. So unfettered home ownership was a great 20th century post-war idea. It's no longer workable as our sole policy focus or as our housing holy grail. We need to revitalise public housing. We need to understand public and social housing provision as infrastructure. This is investing in our communities. It's not residualisation. It's not to be seen as housing of lower quality for humans of lesser quality. This is investing in our communities and our communities' futures. And we need coordination across the levels of government to invest in our housing and in our communities. As with medicine, the arguments and the back and forth and blame shifting between the three tiers of government in housing is extraordinary, and we need to move beyond that. It needs to stop being a political football. So many other countries have thriving, diverse and inclusive housing systems that include not only well-supported public housing, but also stable long-term private rental housing and intermediate tenures like cooperatives, community land trusts and other forms of resale, restricted or sub-market ownership. These can and do provide affordable, stable and accessible housing across a range of price points and in a range of tenure forms. And they balance the needs and interests of the household with those of the broader community, including future generations. There is much we can do in Australia to support these, such as changing our housing tax settings, and at least we are starting to see public discussion of that. It moved out of the totally untouchable into the slightly touchable category. But we also need to provide adequate funding into a renewed social housing system and support the growth of cooperatives and mutuals. We can set affordable statewide housing targets and requirements and grow social and affordable housing in our cities and regions. It's especially important to encourage growth of appropriate finance providers. I think our banking inquiry has shown us a lot about appropriate and inappropriate lending practices. We need lenders who understand the non-profit space and understand housing as a human right and land as a legacy and entity to be stewarded instead of seeing these as endlessly flippable commodities. International evidence shows us these moves are possible and effective, and that the sky doesn't fall if you work strategically to take the heat out of the housing markets, although it might if you leave it to market forces. So our housing system globally, on a comparative level, Australia's housing system is unsophisticated and simplistic, and it's no longer fit for purpose. And this shows. We're seeing delayed home ownership, we're seeing decreasing rates of home ownership in younger communities, we're seeing the growing intensification of ownership in an older and smaller cohort as people expand their property portfolios and first-time homeowners can't get in. We're seeing the emergence of renters who are renting for 10, 20, 30 years, going into retirement, renting in the private market, which our welfare system was never geared up to accommodate. So thinking about housing touches on welfare policies, employment policies, how we care for people. So thinking beyond housing, it's not hard to imagine cities as vibrant ecosystems. We really need to shake off the strange idea that the environment is somewhere else, somehow outside of our cities. As urban Australians on a daily basis, we all interact with magpies, possums, more spiders than is probably reasonable, bats, rats, pigeons, bin chickens. But no matter where you are, you can't live in Sydney and not hear birds. Understanding and embracing our communities as thriving ecosystems can be fundamental to how we start to address climate change by planning cities as nature. We can think about cities that are not only affordable, but that feed us, that provide our energy, that provide our water, that provide our energy, and deal with our wastes. They can also be part of how we live out our espoused principles as a society and embrace our persistent connection to the non-human that makes us uniquely human. So we can create communities in which human and non-human diversity can thrive. I work at the intersection of affordability and sustainability, so when I start talking about affordability, I end up thinking about ecosystems. It's just the way my brain goes. But these things are fundamentally interconnected. The connection between our environmental health, as we just heard, and our social health is absolutely fundamental and basic. So we know what we can do. We see the wonder of what we can be as a society when we mobilise en masse, such as in times of celebration, protest, grief or emergency. So while so much of our current mainstream politics tries to whip us up into being this mob, we know that we're really these mobs. And that image on the top right, if you didn't know what happened there, that's a crowd in Perth who spontaneously tilted that train up to free a person who'd slipped down between the train and the platform. So many of us here will recall the immense amount of resources and goodwill that we deployed in response to the Olympics. If we can do it for sport or in a crisis, why not for our well-being and our future? Arguably, we already are in crisis. So can we use this to mobilise for our individual and collective joy? So there's a way for us to go on to here. I'm really loving the memes that are going around at the moment based on the decluttering movement, which calls for us to discard that which does not spark joy. So it started with excessive homewares that were making people feel claustrophobic. You know, does that 17th throw pillow spark joy or give you a panic attack? If it doesn't spark joy, hug it, thank it, and discard it. That's the philosophy. Now, the really nice thing though is that some people, that means your job, your landlord, or maybe your pants. Now it's expanded to governments. I think it's time for us to collectively apply it not only to our government, but also the central tenets of our housing system and the logic by which we plan and live in our communities. If these do not spark joy and well-being for as many of our fellow Australians, human and non-human, as possible, then being here at Bondi, I think it's time for them to get in the sea. So from here, I think we should go forth and spark joy together.